Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Ways to Future-Proof Your Content, brought to you by Technology Services Industry Association and sponsored by Xyleme. My name's Vanessa Lucero, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording of today's presentation will be sent to you within the next 24 hours via email. Audio will be delivered via streaming. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode. Your webinar controls, including volume, are found below the presenter headshot window. We encourage your comments and questions. If you think of a question for the presenters at any point, please submit through the Ask a Question box on the bottom left side of the webinar player. We will both be answering questions during the webinar and open it up for a Q&A portion at the end of today's session. Lastly, feel free to enlarge the slides to full screen at any time by selecting the Full Screen button, which will appear on the top right corner of the slide player. I would now like to introduce our presenters today, John Ragsdale, Distinguished Vice President of Technology Research for TSIA, and Leslie Farinella, Chief Operating Officer for Xyleme. As with all of our TSIA webinars, we do have a lot of exciting content to cover in the next 45 minutes, so let's jump right in and get started. John, over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're talking about 5 ways to future-proof your content. And while creating learning and information about your products largely falls to the education services or the training group, we are finding that they are starting to either be forced to or hopefully wanting to collaborate with a lot of other groups. Clearly, there's a major tie into customer success to make sure that there is good content for getting customers onboarded so they can adopt and use the technology. Support has a role to play in making sure customers know how to use features when they call and have questions on it. And we're also seeing product management getting more involved in trying to define as part of the product definition process in what content we had and maybe even embedding some of that within the product. So we're going to talk about a lot of trends related to this today. And in my mind, a lot of the trends we're discussing today are a part of this overarching theme of the digital learning revolution. And what I mean by that is for technology firms, and specifically B2B technology firms, in our past when we were mostly on-premise technology companies, we were very focused on content for the classroom. And companies conducted training for their system administrator customers or train the trainer, but very often it was up to individual companies to train their employees on how to use the technology that they brought in. And this is dramatically changing in a cloud world. There's less IT staff to answer questions, and we know that companies are getting more and more calls and emails from end users looking for help on more training and how to better use applications. And so the shift is really happening today toward these digital learning environments. And this means that the way we present the content, the actual format of the content, the way the content is consumed is all dramatically changing. And we're going to be talking about a lot of angles on that conversion today. So to me, one of the important points is if we're going to scale customer education, we want to make sure that we're spending time creating content that can be leveraged for the largest number of customers possible. And I have some data here from our education services benchmark showing that Train the Trainer on average is being delivered to 81 people a year. But look at e-learning. 20,000 people a year are accessing e-learning content, over 10,000 accessing video tutorials. So while we may be not quite as familiar with creating content to be consumed using these digital channels, the truth is that this sort of content better meets the needs of today's customers. Digital content is delivered in smaller bite-sized chunks. It can be delivered just in time, so the first time you're using a feature in an application, you can watch a quick training video or go through a quick tutorial on how to use it. These new digital formats are much easier to consume. I'm going to show you a little data on that. It allows people to learn at their own pace, and there's also more visibility into what they're consuming, how far they're going in the training, what they're watching and not watching, and it allows you to insert little quizzes or clarifying questions at different points throughout the process to make sure that they are comprehending the content. So we just completed a couple of weeks ago our annual channel preference study, and in that we asked thousands of consumers to rate how they prefer to get information about products. And I wanted to share one of the data points with you around YouTube, and this is the percent of people who said that YouTube was a preferred channel for product information. And on average, 42% of all respondents said that YouTube was a preferred channel. But you can see no surprise here for younger customers, 51% of millennials, and two-thirds, 64% of Gen Z say that YouTube is a preferred channel. We also collected data from 11 different countries this year, and it is not just a North American phenomenon. YouTube turns out to be very popular in Central and South America, 43% in Asia Pacific. So I'm not saying that YouTube is the answer for everything, but it does point out that this video and digital content is really becoming much more of a preferred way to consume information. Unfortunately, when we survey our members about how they are in delivering some of these newer formats, the news is not quite as good, and this is some data from my 2019 Knowledge Management Survey, where we ask if you're incorporating videos into your KM processes. And as you can see, only 27% of companies have a dedicated YouTube site, 25% have a library of videos on their self-service site, 28% say they're not doing anything with video at all. So clearly video is just one format for information and for training content, but definitely we need to be much more responsive to the evolving needs of customers. So one more data point for you from our benchmark. We know that one of the reasons companies are struggling a bit with moving to this more digital content is they really just don't always know how to do it. And this data shows that on average it's much more time involved in creating an hour of digital content than instructor-led content. And the reason for this is we've got a lot of folks who just aren't familiar with the new formats, but also there's got to be a lot of investment in new infrastructure to make this much easier. So, I would say if you're looking at this data, keep in mind that maybe the e-learning content does take more time and effort to create than classroom content, but remember that scale slide I showed. We're reaching thousands more people with that content, so it's definitely worth the additional effort. One other advantage to moving to digital content is the metrics that are available for it are so much better than we have had in the past. We're going to spend some time on that a little bit later today. But things such as usage metrics, quality metrics, even gap analysis to understand what content are people looking for and not finding. In a digital world, this is much easier to identify. So there is a lot of planned spending around technology for creating and maintaining learning content. We are seeing that of our members, 70% of our education services member have budget for learning management systems in the next 2 years. 59% have budget for consumption analytics. 61% have budget for knowledge and content management. So clearly companies are understanding that the world is changing. There is this digital revolution, and they're looking at investing heavily in this over the next couple of years. So I'm very happy that you joined us today. I think this is the decision year for a lot of companies, and I think that you're going to find we're going to answer a lot of your questions and explain a lot of these concepts for you today. So with that, I would like to turn things over to our guest speaker today. Leslie Farinella is the Chief Operating Officer for Xyleme. Leslie, welcome to today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you for all those great statistics. So I'm very excited. I want to talk to you today about future-proofing your content. So that's moving into the digital realm, but also the realms we haven't even considered yet. So what we want to do is to make content more adaptable so that you can meet your current needs of users, but we know those needs are constantly changing as well as your business environment. So how can you keep up? And we also know that people are becoming more particular. They want the content to meet them where they are. They want content that is relevant to them and that is easily accessible, all the way from, when we're trying to build awareness and we're trying to get people interested in our solutions, to promoting and educating those solutions, to the product selection, and then to onboarding. So getting them to that first win very quickly, getting them into the product, and also transitioning, because we know there's turnover of users in our product. So how do we get those super users? They move off. How do we train those replacement super users in the different organizations? So we need to look at our content across this entire journey, and we know we need to continue to adapt it. So what we found is that these are 5 key things we found. The good news for us is we get to look at this through 2 lenses. One is we're a technology company, so we live this every day. But 2, we help technology companies to solve their content management problems. So we've been able to look at this problem across a wide range of companies and a wide range of industries. And here's 5 of the best practices that we've identified. So the first one is to make your content more targeted. Now, when I'm talking about content, I'm talking about designing your content, creating the content, and distributing your content. So I really am focusing in on the content. But what we found is that a lot of content has many different needs, and the concepts that we're trying to convey may overlap, but the channels or the format we may put them in is different. So for example, when we have new customers and they've bought our product, they want to jump right in and they want to get to that early win. But we know that if we try to tell them everything we can do with our solution, they quickly get overwhelmed and they're not going to remember it. So we need to start to adapt and figure out what are those primary use cases, how do we get them started so they can get those quick wins, but then how do we keep them moving along and adopting other things within our products. And we also know that we get the novices, so now they're kind of going, they're working the product, but then they have questions or they don't remember something that they heard earlier. So those, they want to get those quick answers, but they don't want to go through large documents to find those answers. They just want to get to that answer as quickly as they can and then move on. And then we know we get those mature customers, they've been doing a lot in our solutions, and then they want to know what else is possible. Like, what are other people doing? What else can I do? And they want those use cases and those stories and to help them move further along the journey. So a lot of the concepts they need are the same, but how and when they want to access them is very different. So we need to target our content to those different needs. So targeted, okay, I do kind of mean micro-learning. I don't like the term micro-learning too much because it implies that short is the most important thing, when I think we all know that really that it's relevant and it's delivered in a timely manner is more important than the size of it. But the first thing that we encourage people to do is kind of go out and look and figure out what are those key concepts that are used all over the place. So figure out what's the 20% that has 80% of the value. It's used in different places across the entire journey. It's used across regions. It's used across different roles. That's a good place to start. So figure out what that content is first. And then what you want to do is you want to chunk it up. So you do want to make it smaller. But when I think about chunking, think about the smallest size that will stand on its own. So here's where I like to start thinking about Lego blocks. So sometimes you need a 2x2 block. Sometimes you need a 2x4 block, or sometimes you need one of those long 2x12 blocks. So people get, I think, a little bit too hung up in micro-learning, like 3 minutes or 10 minutes. Honestly, I don't think it matters. I think the important thing is that it stands on its own. So it's a single concept, and it's the smallest unit that you can get to that stands on its own. And then what you want to do is figure out, because now we want to make it adaptable, what are the different variations. So start to think about across the journey, across your roles, across your regions. So you kind of figure out, how you want to slice and dice it. But what's the same for all customers across all of these, but then what's different? Because that's when you start to resonate with your customers, is when you start to figure out what's unique to that role or to that region. But here's the trick. You want to create those, think Lego blocks again, you want to create those as two different blocks. What we do is we tend to mix those together. So keep the stuff that's the same, put that in one block, and the stuff that's different in another block. And we'll understand more about that and why that becomes important in just a minute. So the first part is keep it targeted. So you want the content to meet them where they are in the journey, and we want it to be relevant to them.
So Leslie, we actually already have our first question. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. How do you target content for each audience?
One good way is to think about the jobs to be done. So what are the jobs that people need to do, and what are the common jobs? So a simple one is logging on, right? Everybody has to log on. So that's a pretty simple one. Or maybe they have to do stuff with invoices. Maybe have an invoicing system. So what's same is the invoicing, but if I'm a manager, I may access that differently than I'm the person who's doing the receivables versus somebody who is entering perhaps the invoice or helping somebody on the phone. So then you start to segment out what's the same and what's different about those different jobs.
This is John. I would think that also goes into what you guys talk about a lot, which is partnering with customer success and learning plans, because you really have to have specific content for specific use cases and roles, and one generic chunk of information is not going to fit everybody's needs.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that, John, is that you want to figure out the generic and the specific and kind of keep those separate, and then you can merge them together. But you're right. And here's where we start to see a partnership or de-siloing across those roles, because you can leverage content across different roles if you stop and think a little bit about how you want to create it, and particularly if you bring it down to smaller chunks. So the next thing we want to think about is making the content flexible. The mistake everybody makes is we trap the content into a specific format and layout. And if we start again, take that Lego blocks, if we just build it in blocks and we don't try to lay it out on a page or make it look a certain way, it really is just the content, then we can use that standalone block by itself, microlearning, or I can take that generic block plus that specific block and put those together, and now I've personalized it to the group. Or I can start to put those blocks together and make a learning path, or I can then put them in a repository, let people search for them, so I can do that performance support that just in time and answering the questions. So your content becomes more flexible when you try not to put it in specific formats. But here's the mindset shift that I want everybody to kind of just take for a moment, is we've kind of all lived in this WYSIWYG world. What you see is what you get, but that is very limiting. So what if we decided content was just the content? Content was the great explanation. Content were maybe the questions we ask people, so they have to kind of think about what they need to get done, or there's checklists. Or maybe the content is just that image that we put together that helps to describe a complex concept. The content is just the content. It has nothing to do with the layout on the page. Now we've created something that's much more flexible. The other thing we found when you start to think about content that way, it's just the words, the text, the images, is how much time people waste with the putting stuff on the page. I mean, how many of you have spent hours fussing with PowerPoint or Word, where suddenly your bullets are all skewed all over the place, or trying to get all your headers to match up, or everything to line up right on the page? I mean, I want all those hours back. There's hours that we waste fussing with stuff. And then how many of you have wasted so many hours, trying to respond to the branding police? You're going through, you're making sure we have the right colors and the right fonts and the right logos. What if we could take that all away? What if we could layer that on with technology and the authors, the people creating the content, just focus on the content? So here's a world I'd like to describe to you. So we have our blocks. So we've created those Lego blocks. I can assemble them to my outputs, and they're in a flexible format, XML. So then I have the XML. Then I can create publishing themes. And these publishing themes will allow me to publish out my content. So I can make it into HTML5, so it looks like a web page. I can put it in a scoring package if I do need to do more formal training where I can track for certifications. I can put it into Word, PowerPoint, PDF, any format I want. And as I do that, I'm layering on the page layout, the branding, the styles, the spacing, the margins, headers, footers, disclaimers, copyrights, all that stuff gets put on by the technology. And I can take those Lego blocks, and now I can create this rich library of products and resources that I can send out in many different ways to my customers. And I can easily adapt those as my needs change. So that's the world I'd like us to think about for a little bit, is just stop trapping your content into these special formats.
Leslie, I have another question for you. What are common barriers you see to making content more flexible?
We trap it. So if we think about the tools we use today, we tend to handcraft everything. So we handcraft it, and we've trapped our content into these beautiful PDF outputs or these beautiful PowerPoints or these great, e-learning kind of extravaganzas. But the problem is it's trapped there. And now if I want to go update it, it's a lot of work, and I can't reuse it. I can't adapt it. I almost have to start over.
Yeah, I'll just add a comment there. In a survey last year, we found that 47% of our members had made no updates to their website or their content to make it more easily consumable on mobile devices. And we all know that people are consuming more content and spending more time on mobile devices than PCs. So to me, this is very exciting that they can author the content once and then make sure that it's easily consumable in whatever device you want to use.
Absolutely, because it's an XML, right? I can do whatever I want with it, and I can make it adapt to the different screen sizes very easily. Which brings us to what we were kind of alluding to so far, is this idea of reuse. So if I want to make my content reusable, so if I have my Lego blocks, I put them in a repository, so I have these reusable objects that I can assemble into these different outputs. And now I'm not trapped in that one-size-fits-all world. I could start to adapt my content to the different audiences and my different needs. So reusing will let you do a lot more with your content as you go through.
So Leslie, we have a few questions about the flexible area, so I'm going to go back really quick. What are some obstacles you can see for customers who are using Xyleme to manage content across several languages?
Obstacles, people using Xyleme across several languages? To Xyleme, none. Xyleme manages translations. So what we do is, but this is kind of separate from what we've been talking about, but the content's in XML. The nice thing about XML content is translation vendors love it. So you can easily extract that content, and because you're just taking the text and send it out to translation and bring it back in. Because Xyleme is a content management system, it's a database basically, so we know what's been translated, what hasn't been translated, when's the last time it was translated. So we keep all of those translation versions in sync. And again, because we've separated out that text from the layouts, when you bring that translation strings back in, we can then adjust for the different string lengths, because we know part of the pain of translating is the strings are different lengths, and what we do is we just automatically reflow all of the outputs, so you get rid of that manual effort. So it's cheaper because the vendors don't charge you as much, and it's less manual effort on your side.
Okay, our next question is, what technology options are available to achieve this flexibility?
Well, pretty much a learning content management system. So if you try to use, a lot of the tools that are out there, they're in proprietary formats. They don't, some of them will let you publish into different formats, but most of them won't do both digital and print. So it's really only your learning content management systems that are going to give you the power to really create a lot of different outputs from your content.
Let's get one more question in, Leslie, before you move on. How much reuse is feasible?
30%. So we find, and 30% may not sound like a lot, but you get huge savings with that amount. So if we think about the cost and the time, as John alluded to, how much time it takes to create every hour of content. If I could save 30% of that through reuse, that's big. But I'm going to talk about maintenance in just a minute, and you'll see on the maintenance side, you'll save even more.
Thanks, Leslie.
Excellent. Lots of good questions. Thank you. So here's about when people said, okay, well, what's the catch to creating all of these different versions? And the reason we've all pretty much been stuck in this one-size-fits-all world is because the maintenance will kill you. We do one version because we can maintain one version and keep it up to date pretty well. But as you can see from this formula, as soon as I start trying to create a lot of different derivatives, my maintenance just grows exponentially. So we call this the content explosion. And so people don't do it because they just can't keep up with it. So that's, again, where technology can come in. So I have my reusable blocks, and we just talked about 30% could be reused if I link don't copy. So when I reuse in today's world, in most tools like Word, PowerPoint, we've all reused PowerPoint slides, but what happens? I copy paste. And as soon as I do that, that's great. Up until the point I need to go update this because something has changed. Now I got to go find every place this piece of content was used that I copied it, and I got to go update it in all those different places. So what we've come up with is the idea of link, don't copy. So again, it's in a database. So I link it in, and what that means is I only have to update it one place, and the content will be updated every place that content is used. But that's really only one side of the coin. So we also find in copy paste, and the way that is that we take content and we put it in different places in our environment. So maybe it is that same PowerPoint deck, or it is that same video, or that same e-learning, but I put it in my LMS, and maybe I have it in my customers' LMSs, or maybe I have it on 2 different learning portals, or all of my instructors have a copy. The problem with that, again, is when it changes, I have to go update it every place it is. And how many of you have searched for days to find all the places that content is, and then you find out a couple months later you missed the spot? So again, what Xyleme has done is that, we can solve this problem with technology. We could put all that content in the central repository, and then what we can do is just put a pointer every place we want to put that content. And what that means is I update it once in the repository, and it updates everywhere. I want to put that content, so I can put it 10, 20, 100 places, doesn't matter. There's no additional maintenance to it. It updates it every place it is. And that way my content is always up to date. It's always in sync, and everybody's always looking at the same version. So don't let the maintenance overwhelm you. The problem with some of the digital and the things that John was talking about earlier, and one of the barriers why people haven't done it, is the maintenance. The maintenance will eventually kill you if you don't bring technology to bear on the problem.
Hey, Leslie, I'm going to jump in again with another question. Many times you get content from a source that is pre-formatted in a PowerPoint, for example. Do you suggest deconstructing content in a more generic format like XML that can be used in different ways?
That is what I'm advocating. So that can be a little tricky to decompose, particularly PowerPoint, because PowerPoint really doesn't have a good way to extract the data from XML from it. Word's probably a little bit easier and some of the others. But usually what I would suggest is find tools that you can author the content that you can extract it in XML easily. So think about the tools that you're using and think about, whether they're tracking your content or they're going to allow your concept to adapt.
Okay, and let's get one more question in. What type of savings have you seen?
Well, we've seen across our customers, we'll have about a 20 to 40% reduction in development time. Because again, remember I talked about you fussing with the templates and the layouts, and it's amazing how much time you waste there. And then being able to sync that content, you spend a lot of time with that. Maintenance is where you see the big lift. So you can start to see 50 or 60% reduction in maintenance. I've had customers go even higher, but on average it's 40 to 60%. Again, because you're linking and you're not copying and you're not having to. Again, if you change branding, you had a branding project, you change branding, or sometimes you just can republish it through those authoring templates, so it can be republished pretty quickly. Some of the other things that people have found that's harder to quantify is really in the consistency, because if you're layering on all of your formatting and stuff later and letting the system do it for you, then everything is consistent. Because humans aren't involved, the system isn't going to change. We've all tried to make stuff fit on a PowerPoint slide, even though it's supposed to be 18 fonts and we're all getting it down to 10 or 12. But if the system's putting it on, you don't have a choice. That's what it's going to be. So you start to get that consistency. And the other is keeping everything up to date, right? The accuracy. Just making sure, just from a credibility or people, not getting frustrated because they can't find the latest version, everything is up to date.
Great, thanks, Leslie.
Thank you. So the last piece, and John alluded to this is a big one, is trackable. So if I get my content and I put it into a digital repository, as John said, and it's all in a single repository, I think that's part of our other problem is our content is all over the place. It's in different SharePoint sites, it's in different repositories or content management systems, or even just stuck on people's laptops. But if I get everything from the same place and people are consuming it, I can start to get some really good metrics. So I can start to see what's the most consumed content, what's the least consumed content. I can start to see how long are people spending on a page. I might find that everybody's dropping off at page 5. And you might ask, well, why? Well, maybe they got what they needed, and that's good. They moved on. Or maybe they got frustrated and they left. So the data won't tell you all the answers, but it definitely can point you in the direction to start to investigate and dig into it. But with tracking, the key part is about being able to segment that data. So knowing what's the most popular or the least popular is somewhat interesting, but you tend to find the most popular is kind of stuff that's just too common. But you want to be able to start to segment the content by maybe industry. So what content is healthcare looking at versus insurance? Or by role. So what content are the managers looking at versus the end users? Or the system administrators. So being able to segment that content is where you get a lot of the power. And then you get supercharged when you can extract that content and you can put it, combine it with other business content. So if I look at my best performing customers, what are they doing? And if I look at my least performing customers, or those that have churned, or their usage is way low, what are they looking at, or what are they doing? Or even my best reps. So my best reps, what content are they looking at versus the worst? So being able to segment that data is where you get a lot of the power. So knowing what your content is doing, then you can have that feedback loop, because you really want that whole cycle. So I take that information, I can use it to continue to adapt and improve my content.
All right, Leslie, we have one question, being cognizant of the time. We use a content management system to publish some of our offer material. What are some best practices for maintaining the underlying data structure as the content evolves?
Can you say that one again? That was a mouthful. So you use a content management system, and you're looking at maintaining the, you guys are getting really specific here, looking at maintaining the data structure. Well, you know what? I don't know about other systems. So I can only answer this one related to our content management system, which is our structure is baked in. So you can't change the structure, and that's part of what makes it so powerful is we have a very detailed schema. And based on our schema, that's how we store the XML. It's well-formed XML, but you can't change it. And because you can't change it is why we can do those publishing themes. It's why we can adapt the content. So that's what gives us our power.
Yeah, this is John. I wanted to make a comment. This last section, you know, I'm absolutely enamored with those dashboards showing how people are using and consuming the content. And I would think that that would also relate back to your previous point. We know from survey work that the reason most companies' programs fail is because of maintenance, that they're really good at getting excited about building content, but they end up with a lot of poor and duplicate content, and people stop using it because it's hard to find the good stuff. And I would think that with this kind of usage info, it's going to be a lot easier to identify the content no one's using, or they're submitting negative sentiment about, to help weed that out. So do you see that usage information feeding back into the maintenance loop?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can start to retire a lot of stuff that you just realize nobody's using. You can go investigate why. Sometimes they couldn't find it, right? So sometimes the answer is people couldn't find the content, making sure that it's available. Sometimes it was too big, right? They found it, but nobody wants to go through a 100-page manual. So as soon as they hit that, they're like, oh, that's just too much, and they move on. And you just need to chunk it up. But sometimes it's just not useful. And then you can decide maybe it's something that people don't need. We could just retire it, or we need to rethink how we did it. But definitely it is very powerful, the amount of information that you can get from those metrics and the amount of time you'll save, because before you don't know, you're just investing money into creating content, but you're not really sure how it's performing. So those are the 5 ways. So hopefully, you can take some of those and use them right away. So regardless of what tool you're using, you can definitely make your content targeted. So start to break it up into smaller pieces. Think micro-learning. People say that a lot, but I said, really don't get hung up on the size. It's more about bringing it down to the smallest useful unit. Try to make it more flexible. So think about, as you're selecting your tools, are you locking your content into a particular format? So we have some customers who they started at print. Now they're putting their content into digital and web, but some are even starting to feed it to augmented reality and chatbots. Because it's an XML, you can do whatever you want. And honestly, I don't know 3 to 5 years from now what type of content you're going to need, but I'm pretty sure that XML is pretty flexible, so you can start to push your content out. Reuse, even if you do copy-paste, there is some savings there, but you do end up with the maintenance. So then figure out how you're going to maintain that content and see if you can start to track it. But if you really want to scale, and that's part of what John said earlier, is really about getting to scale, you're going to need technology to help you. So that's where you want to look at the category of learning content management systems is different from a content management system in that learning being the key word that you add there, learning content management systems are designed to allow you to author the content. And it's really when you can author it in that XML, so it has that authoring tool. So you put the content in XML, lots of savings there because you're not fussing, like we said, with all of those formats and stuff. You just get your SMEs, they put the content in, and then you can publish it out. You can create those themes we talked about. You can decide how you want the different layouts. You can have different themes for web, looks kind of like the web page, or you can have it look like a traditional e-learning with the next. Not sure why, but you could. And you could even do score them if you needed to do that for certifications. And then you can deliver that content. So once you publish it, you can put it in that central repository. so that people can search that repository if they like, or you can then put those links or pointers anywhere you want in your ecosystem, but you only have to update the content in one place. And you can finally get that tracking that we were talking about. So it's really here where technology is going to be required in order for you to scale.
All righty, Leslie. Well, do you have any closing remarks before we jump into the Q&A, or should I just jump right in?
Jump right in.
Okay. So our first question is going to be, can you speak to how version control is accomplished in the context of content that may need to meet regulatory compliance requirements, for example, QSDs?
Auditors love learning content management systems, so we definitely have a sweet spot with high compliance. I can speak to our system. So our system has full version control. We keep a whole history of versions. We also have a review session, so we even know the feedback and the comments that people made for the review. We know who modified every single piece of content down to the table, the list items. So we know who modified it, when was the last time it was modified. You can put expiration dates on content. And then from the consumption side, we know who accessed it, what version they saw, when they saw that version, and every page they viewed and how long they were on a page. So because it's in a database, it's just easy to collect all of those metrics from a compliance perspective.
Okay, next question. Can you segment content and groups?
Absolutely, on both sides. So you could segment on the authoring side so that you can determine who has access to what content and who's allowed to update the content. So you can say that Leslie can reuse the content, but only Vanessa is allowed to update the content. And then on the consumption side, absolutely, you can determine, usually via SSO, but we also have user managers that you could do, who gets to see which content. You can either do that by piece of content, but it's really easier if you do it by tagging. So you can tag the content and then you can match it with user profiles and discern, people with this profile get to see this set of content, different profiles the others, which means I can take away a lot of the noise. So I can say that I know that you're in this particular role, so this is the content that's most valuable to you, or I know that you're interacting with this product of ours, therefore this content is most valuable to you.
Okay, let's take one last question before we close, Leslie. Have you ever seen LMS integrated with knowledge bases?
All the time. So almost all of our customers also have an LMS. So I think of us, to me, an LMS, it manages the events and the assignments. So they say, these people must take this subset of stuff, or they let people register for content. And we really are focused on the content itself. So on the one side, the explanations, the question banks, the images, assembling those, and then being able to, render them into an output, whether it's a job aid, a checklist, instructor-led training, or an e-learning or a micro-learning. So we really on the content side, and then that would get fed to an LMS. And again, what we do with that is we put that pointer in the LMS so that when you update it in our system, it pushes those updates to the LMS. Some of our customers love the fact that you can also put that pointer into their customer's LMS. And as you know, many times, if any of you have to do that today, it's a pain because you got to send the file, it's usually a pretty big file, to the customers, and then you got to wait for them to update it. So you're not always sure that they've updated in a timely manner. But in this, you can send a file, it's a couple kilobytes, they put in their LMS, and then you can push those updates, which means you can do incremental updates and not have to do these big batch rewrites to update that content.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank both you and John for just presenting a great webinar today, and we have come to the conclusion of today's live webinar. Just a couple of quick reminders before we sign off for today. There will be an exit survey at the end of today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to provide your feedback on the content and your experience by filling out that brief survey. And a link to the recorded version of today's webinar will be sent out within the next 24 hours. Once again, thank you so much to John and Leslie for delivering an outstanding session, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar, 5 Ways to Future-Proof Your Content, brought to you by Technology Services Industry Association and sponsored by Xyleme. We look forward to seeing you at our next TSIA webinar. Take care, everyone.